We have started recording. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ty Jones. I'm the curator for American history here at the Rare Book and Manuscript Library. And I'm so pleased to welcome you to Liberty's Chain, Slavery, Abolition, and the Jay Family of New York. This is the final curatorial short of the year. Organized by my colleague, curator for literature, Lena Moe, this semester's program has already featured an eclectic series of conversations ranging from digitizing audiovisual materials from the Amiri Baraka collection to relations between Jews and Christians in 17th century France to a conversation about an oversized scrapbook created by a Kansas City barber. Stay tuned for information about spring programming. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. David Gellman is professor of history at DePauw University, where he has taught since 1999. And we're discussing work from his latest book, Liberty's Chain, Slavery, Abolition, and the Jay Family of New York, which will be published in spring 2022 by Three Hills, an imprint of Cornell University Press. Among his other publications are Emancipating New York, The Politics of Slavery and Freedom, 1777 to 1827, and Jim Crow New York, A Documentary History of Race and Citizenship, 1777 to 1877. He is a member of the editorial board of the Journal of the Early Republic and has held research fellowships at the Huntington Library, the American Antiquarian Society, and the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. Robb Haberman is an historian and scholarly editor who teaches at Fordham University. His current research explores how memories of the American Revolution shaped New York's electoral politics in the early republic. Robb was a very familiar figure here at the RBML. He served for 7 years as an associate editor for the John Jay papers, during which time he helped produce volumes 4 through 7 of the selected papers of John Jay. Haberman's work on media and politics in revolutionary America has also appeared in such publications as American Periodicals, Early American Studies, and New York History. In addition, Haberman also served as lead curator on the virtual and on-site exhibition In Service to the New Nation, The Life and Legacy of John Jay, which is on site now in Butler's Rare Book and Manuscript Library and will continue through the end of January. So now it's my pleasure to turn things over to Robb. Thank you.
Thank you, Ty, and thank you, David, for joining us today and discussing your forthcoming publication. So I want to start out looking at Liberty's Chain, Slavery, Abolition, and the Jay Family of New York. So this is coming out in April. And I think it would be helpful if you provide us with an elevator pitch of your upcoming publication. So basically, imagine you're in an elevator with someone for 2 minutes and you have to tell them in that time about Liberty's Chain. What would you say?
Well, fortunately, elevator rides in Manhattan are a lot longer than elevator rides in Greencastle, Indiana. So that gives me a little more leeway.
Right.
So appreciate that. I like to think of this book as a study in the transmission and transformation of values. So what do I mean by that? You have John Jay, who's born into a prominent elite slaveholding family in New York State, founding father associated with being the first US Supreme Court Justice, Chief Justice, key early American diplomat, important Federalist politician, governor of New York. And I think Jay embodies a lot of the contradictions we associate with the American Revolution precisely because of this issue of slavery and freedom. Because he's not only the owner of enslaved people and comes from a family that has owned and traded in slaves since they arrived as Huguenot refugees in 1685, but he's also the inaugural president of one of the most important early anti-slavery societies in the Western world, the New York Manumission Society. So right there is sort of, there's a paradox baked into this. And then his descendants, particularly his second son, William Jay, and his grandson and namesake, John Jay II, go on to embrace radical abolitionism in the 19th century, the cause most likely to rend apart the very nation that John Jay, a person who they revere, helped to found. So there's this tension, I think of sort of magnetic poles. There's this identity with the founding, but then there's the issue of slavery. And as they become more radical, these things pull apart. right? They're going in different directions until with the Civil War, John Jay II is able to sort of snap them back together. And so watching the arc of this narrative from the American Revolution through Reconstruction with some commentary on what happens before and after enables me to tell a long arc of incredibly consequential history for the nation through the prism of a single family. And it's a family, by the way, in which not only were there enslaved people going back, well into the 18th century, but the descendants of these enslaved people remain, in some cases, with the family. So the last formerly enslaved person associated with the Jay family doesn't die until 1872, a woman by the name of Zilpah Montgomery, about whom I'm sure I will speak at greater length. And then she's buried in the Jay family plot at their church in Bedford. And so there's no forgetting, there's no amnesia, that's not on the table. So that as they wrestle with the implications of the American Revolution for themselves and for their family and for the nation, and as they wrestle with slavery, they're not forgetting the past, they're trying to make sense and give meaning to a past that is by definition imperfect because of this entanglement with and practice of slavery. And so it allows me to tell sort of an interlocking series of family stories across a sort of vast temporal landscape. And finally, since this elevator is going all the way to the top, it gives us a different angle of vision, I think. Not necessarily better, but a different angle of vision than we usually get when we think about the founders in slavery, which is very, let's face it, very Monticello centered. And certainly for obvious reasons, tilts towards the South. But by telling a story of a Northern family that is deeply involved in this issue, and the issue of slavery sort of defines them for generations, it enables us to think in different and new and more complicated ways about this legacy and how it unfolds and morphs and changes over time.
Yeah, interesting. And we've reached the penthouse floor now. So following up on this, I think this is one of the most, intriguing aspects of your book, that at least the way that you're framing it, that you've focused it as a multi-generational study. And I'm wondering, was this always the plan to undertake this? And I have a few more follow-up questions to go along with this. Because one thing, using such an approach, it would be interesting. I'd like to hear more about, what insights are brought to the surface that would not have been evident if you had focused on a single generation of the Jay family. Moreover, as you noted, the Jay family has a long recorded genealogy. So can you share with us how you decided where to actually start and where to end with telling the stories that are presented in your book?
Well, that's a great question. And, certainly if I knew then what I know now, I probably wouldn't have had the guts to jump in, because I did not imagine working on this project for the length of time I did. And some of that has to do with just the serendipity of life. But a lot of it has to do with that realization that if I was going to tell a multi-generational story, I was going to really have to go back, before the revolution, and I was going to have to go well beyond the revolution into Reconstruction and beyond. And so I kept adding people and characters, and it kept growing sort of organically. In other words, I did not have it all mapped out when I started. I knew that William Jay was the biographer of his father, the first biographer of his father, and was the inheritor of the what John Jay II later labeled the homestead. And originally I thought I was just going to focus pretty tightly on that relationship, but it became pretty clear to me that John Jay II, about whom far too little, almost nothing of scholarly vein has been written. There are no scholarly biographies. And there's very little, surprisingly little on William Jay, let alone Peter Augustus Jay, John's oldest son, also an abolitionist. And so the attraction was that obviously John Jay was going to be the most recognizable figure and the one that maybe got people in the door. But watching how his children and grandchildren make sense of his legacy, specifically with regard to slavery, just became it just became a bigger story with more and more branches. And then there, his nephew, Peter J. Monroe, was also a president of the New York Manumission Society. So you start to realize that to sort of truly tell this story about the legacy of the revolution, you have to take seriously the people who directly inherited that legacy and wrestled with it. And so it did grow over time. And, historians love change and continuity, and they love change over time. And yes, John Jay's life spans a tremendous amount of time. So you can track certain changes in his attitudes over slavery from his youth through his old age. But the recognition that, in the Jay family, and really in most families, it's not a relay race. There's not some smooth pass of the baton and then the next generation keeps on running. They're running alongside each other, and they're learning from each other, and they're having conversations, some of which we're privy to because of the wonderful archives at Columbia, and some of which we can only imagine because they're face-to-face interactions. But that they're understanding themselves and the issue of slavery over time through their interaction with each other and through their interaction with enslaved and formerly enslaved people in their presence, and that their public selves and their private selves are two sides of a very complicated coin. And so that you're also looking at generations of enslaved people and formerly enslaved people and what legacies they partake in as we move from slavery to freedom in the North and ultimately the nation, and to what legacies they're unable to take in because of their racial classification and their status and what they suffered through. And so really seeing this over time, I came to realize, seeing the Jay, if you just did a study of John Jay, you would miss so much of the story. And if you just did a study of any one individual, you'd miss so much of the story, because they are so enmeshed psychologically and practically and materially in each other's lives, and living in each other's houses. And so it also makes it as distant as the past is and as particular as the Jay family is. I also wanted to tell a story that, everyone has a family and comes from a family, and even the least reflective of amongst us think about who we are in relation to who our parents or our grandparents are. And so I was able to bring this potentially very abstract and ideologically oriented story to a personal level that I think invites people in to this sweep from the revolution through Reconstruction, rather than keeps people out.
Right. And to follow up on this aspect, looking at the Jay family and particularly the central role of John Jay, I had two questions that I'm going to kind of combine here. One, looking at, and this is a question that I think scholars, including myself and I know the other members of the John Jay editing team, have grappled with, is this question of how does John Jay reconcile his role as a leading abolitionist or anti-slavery advocate in New York State with his status as a slaveholder? It would be interesting to know, are there any instances before his governorship or while he's in retirement where he openly or maybe more subtly confronts this contradictory relationship? And at the same time, one thing I'm very much interested in is, did his children or later descendants, do they ever comment, critique, express remorse, or chastise the paterfamiliar John Jay for his slaveholding activities?
Great question, and I'm sure the people who, like you, who've sort of immersed yourself in the John Jay papers, in some ways more broadly than I have, can tell me if I'm right. But John Jay is not a real confessional sort. He's not one to pour out his doubts and his sort of unrevealed emotions in his writings. He never really wrote an autobiography, just the beginnings of a sketch. So for expressions of remorse, you have to sort of look more for what he does than what he says. But I think frustratingly, right, I think he truly believes in the gradual emancipation program as a means of change. I don't think we may see the flaws and the deep flaws in that, but I think he really believed that this was the appropriate means of unwinding what he recognized, by 1780 as a real evil. But he believed in his own sort of moral rectitude. He believed that he was committed to the long-term project, and therefore he was going to be in for the long haul. And I can be a little less abstract there by saying the proof of it is the way he manumits Zilpa applies the formula of gradual emancipation to her, even though she's not covered because of the timing of her birth by the original law. He just decides, all right, well, she's about to turn 25. And interestingly, I think he's actually slightly off on her age, which in some ways further proves my point that he's really, in 1817, when the state is about to pass their final emancipation law that will go into effect in 1827, John Jay says, basically, it's time for me to emancipate Zilpa as she approaches her 25th birthday, which, for people who know the story of gradual emancipation in New York, know that's the age that women born after July 4th, 1799, the children of enslaved mothers, get their freedom. So he literally applies in a voluntary fashion the formula that his organization and his state applied to the larger problem, which suggests to me that as troubling as it is, right, he believes in the formula that it will slowly, surely, but inevitably bring slavery to an end. Now, on the question of, and I'm certainly happy to elaborate on that, but on the question of remorse, about the closest I've found is Peter Augustus Jay heroically fights the disenfranchisement of African-American men at the convention of 1821. We're at that 200th anniversary of that convention this year that goes and in January, we'll be at the 200th anniversary of it being approved by New York's voters. And it disenfranchises, and the intent was to disenfranchise African-American men entirely, and then it was negotiated down to a property holding requirement. At any rate, Peter Augustus Jay, in one of his speeches, specifically talks about the sins of the fathers, right? Like, why are African-Americans degraded? Because of the sins of the fathers. And he gives this speech, and John Jay, who's retired, writes Peter Augustus Jay up at the convention and says, he doesn't single out any particular part of the speech, but he said, basically, essentially, I approve, or it speaks well of you that you gave that speech. That's about as close as I've ever found to John Jay acknowledging guilt or complicity, is that he just quietly says to Peter Augustus Jay in just one line, essentially, the speech does you credit. And then after that, we have to look at his actions. I mean, as some people know, one of his last public acts, about 10 years before he dies, but one of his last big public acts is allowing his name to be associated with opposing the admission of Missouri as a slave state, in which he copies down passages from the Declaration of Independence and says that the Constitution gives the national government the right to regulate the movement of enslaved people, and that Missouri's admission should be resisted. Is that an admission of guilt? No. But it is kind of where he wound up in public. And then I guess the last thing I'd say is, he's very good at compartmentalizing the issue of slavery. It's easier for him to imagine fighting slavery in some parts of his political world than in others. So on the diplomatic front, he's willing to concede that no, we really don't have much of a right to ask the British to compensate Americans for enslaved people carried away at the end of the Revolution, even though he's the one who helped negotiate the treaty that put that in. He's able to, just to walk away from that and say that this would be odious. But when it comes to when he gets chastised by, I think, Grenville Sharp for the way the Constitution fails to deal with slavery, he sort of throws his hands up and says, there are some spheres in which we can, like the state sphere, where we can do something about slavery, but the national sphere is not one where we really have the power to act. So he's able to sort of, he has the luxury of being able to decide which parts of the sort of concentric circles that define his personal and political being, which ones of those circles he can act affirmatively and which ones he has to sort of to acknowledge compromise and falling short.
And do his children or grandchildren ever, bring up, particularly in public, the role of John Jay? Certainly they spoke to him as being a primary supporter of the New York state law that is passed in 1799. Do they ever mention his role as a slaveholder?
I mean, that's a great question. So the closest you come to sort of a public acknowledgement is in William Jay's very influential treatise on federal policy towards slavery. It begins with a statement that our fathers, plural, made a guilty compromise. And, he pluralizes father, just as his older brother said, the sins of the father, but not necessarily specifically naming his own father. But, that's a pretty big statement to make in a book at the beginning of a very, very influential treatise on federal policy towards slavery. Everybody knows who William Jay is. And that leads to one of the sort of major leitmotifs of the middle third of the book, is the way that William Jay is over time is repeatedly called out by those less radical than him, who say, how can you take such a radical, uncompromising position in favor of immediate emancipation when your father, who we all agree is, a great and wonderful man, was a gradualist, who believed in doing this gradually, who was a moderate. And so repeatedly, and this gets William Jay's back up every time from the 1830s all the way into the 1850s. It drives him to distraction. And he is very defensive about that. And he, in private correspondence, he will say, I imbibe my anti-slavery, and that's a word, that's a direct quote, imbibe. I imbibe my anti-slavery from my father. It's harder to document the imbibing but on the other hand, the two men lived together in the same house for not just his childhood. I mean, William Jay moves back there after his eyes are bad and he's not going to become a politician lawyer in Albany anymore, and he moves back home. And so he and John Jay he and his father spend decades together, presumably discussing the news of the day. So who are we to doubt that he imbibed something from his father? But it is something that vexes him, that he's very defensive about again and again, when people say, how can you be so fanatical? Or Moses Stewart, the theologian, imagines a portrait of John Jay looking down on his extreme fanatic son and, being disappointed. And William Jay simply refuses, not only refuses, he'll go on the attack, whenever people say that. Because I think for William Jay, his point is John Jay understood the principle, and then we who were, alive in our times get to decide what the method is. Right. And that it's the principle that he was anti-slavery. That's the legacy, and the critics want to make his legacy his moderation or his gradualism, and William Jay will not take that point sitting down.
Okay, and switching gears away from the Jay family themselves, I'd be interested to hear more about how life changes for the African-American community that lives with or nearby to the Jay family, particularly as African-Americans undergo a transition from a condition of enslavement to one of freedom. And related to this, please, I'd appreciate if you could speak to why do some individuals remain with the Jays even after attaining the status of a free person? And I'd also very much like to hear if you have any stories that you find particularly engaging or enlightening that you've come across in the course of your research that tell the lives of these African Americans who worked for and with the J family?
Well, I mean, there are many, too many sort of moving and troubling and challenging stories to tell, but I'll tell a few. The first one, why do people remain? I mean, most of the people who remain, specifically in the J homestead, it's Clorinda and her daughter Zilpah, who's the one who's with the family or in the orbit of the family until her death in 1872. There's an enslaved man named Caesar who is in Peter Augustus Jay's 1843 will, although he's hard to find in the census, but annuity is bequeathed to him. For the people who remain, it's a story of it being too late in a lot of ways, right? By the time their freedom comes, they've been in some ways cut off from, divided from family, the ability to form communities. Zilpah had lost a child, and actually Clorinda had also lost another child. I mean, these are people where this may in fact be, materially speaking, and in some ways in terms of familiarity, the J home that Peter Augustus Jay inherits in Rye, and then the J homestead up in the Bedford-Katona area. In some ways, unfortunately, this is the place in the world they've known, because their worlds have become so circumscribed over time. I think that explains a lot of the sort of persistence. But the stories are, powerful and revealing, even going back to the 1741, the so-called Great Negro Plot of 1741. I mean, there are Peter Jay and even Augustus Jay, the original American Jays, enslaved people, are mentioned in those trial transcripts. And Brash, who's a enslaved member of Peter Jay's household, he is not executed, but he is sent off to Madeira because he's where one assumes the end, life did not end well. Because he's implicated in the conspiracy. But probably the two people who are most fascinating, we can circle back to the story that Martha Jones wrote about in the New York Times, that I also write about, the story of Abby, but since that's gotten a lot of press, I think I'll skip past that and we can come back later. But the story of Clorinda and Zilpah is kind of the most powerful through line. So Clorinda had been an enslaved person in John Jay's father's family, Peter Jay, in revolutionary times. And, she remains with the family, and she has a daughter named Zilpah, and Zilpah gets pregnant in her teen years, and John Jay decides, well, we can't have her around, and basically indentures her to a Livingston relative. And that child dies, and Clorinda, in a kind of a gutsy move, says, please bring her back. And she's got no leverage, she's got no power, right? This is a very patriarchal society. And she convinces John Jay to bring Zilpah back, having been cast out for one, John Jay was always skeptical of having servants with small children around, and two, I think it sort of offended his moral sensibilities. But when the child dies, Zilpah comes back and never leaves. And John Jay does officially manumit her in 1817. It's more, Clorinda is manumitted more silently, like in the 1820 census, she suddenly appears as a free person. I've not found any documentation, nor am I aware of anyone else who's found documentation about a specific manumission. But at this point, Clorinda's pretty old. And they sort of mother and daughter live out their lives together. When Clorinda dies in 1837, there's a letter where William writes about how she's freaked out to have to keep staying in the room where her mother died. And William Jay sort of says, so she'll let her sleep with the white servants, because, not because, and he doesn't really, there's not a lot of introspection, but he he sort of grants that this might be an uncomfortable, emotionally very difficult thing for her. And she remains in the family. Like I say, she's not in the census all the way through, but she remains in the orbit of the family until her death. And William J. and his will upon his death, grants her an annuity and promises her a place. And again, these things, I'm not saying this is anything way like some great gift or some noble thing, but says she'll be buried in the family plot in the St. Matthew's graveyard where the other J's of that branch of the family are buried. And so she is in 1872 in the middle of Reconstruction. And she never was literate. And the passage of the 15th Amendment that secured the right for African American to vote would not have obviously touched her. And she had been freed, well over a generation before the Civil War. And so she lives out this sort of quiet, relatively anonymous life where oftentimes William J's wife will write the children and say, please, send your regards to Zilpah, or Zilpah asked after you. So, they're deeply enmeshed in each other's day-to-day lives, but whether and how much the white Jays understand what it means to be a servant in their household and to feel as if that's kind of the best option, the most viable option. Increasingly, the servant staff of the Jays are Irish immigrants. If you sort of look at it over time, if you look at the censuses, and so in some ways, like she would have become more isolated over time as African American servants, some of whom were hired and indentured, are replaced by Irish immigrants, and as she grows older. One can only sort of imagine and think about how increasingly circumscribed her world became over time. But there she, remained in the Jay's orbit all the way to her death. And I don't want to just repeat myself, but the Jays can't imagine that they have no connection to this institution, nor do they. Right? There is no sign of amnesia, to use a term another scholar used a long time ago about New England abolitionists. They are fully aware. They are pretty consistently against colonization, like the idea that African Americans' freedom should take place elsewhere does not compute, I think, intellectually or emotionally for the Jays. They do not imagine African Americans as not as part of the sort of American social makeup. I mean, they have their notions of eliteness and hierarchy, but that is never for them, that sort of fantasy of dismissal. So hopefully, I mean, there are other stories to tell, but I'll stop there.
I can't wait to when the book comes out, so to read more of these specific accounts that are discussed within. Related to this, and focusing again on the period of the antebellum era and the decades leading up to the Civil War, I'm interested to know, do we have any evidence that as the members of the Jay household embrace radical abolitionism, do we know if either they or members of the African American community living on Jay properties or connected with them participated in the Underground Railroad or engaged in any quasi-legal or even illegal activities to further the anti-slavery cause?
The answer is yes, illegal and extra legal and legal. The thing about the Underground Railroad, to state the obvious, is especially if you are, remember, William Jay is a judge, not a federal judge, but a state judge, and a sworn officer of the Constitution, but and then he's replaced by a pro-slavery New York governor in the 1840s. But yes, we absolutely have evidence that the Underground Railroad occasionally ran through Bedford. I have a letter that I got from actually another archive other than the Jay archive there at Columbia. The Sidney Howard Gay collection has a wonderful letter from William J., where he says, I have a fugitive. So William J. writes to Sidney Howard Gay in 1854, I have a fugitive who wishes to go to Boston via Albany. Do give me by return mail the names of one or more in each place to whom a consignment can safely be made.
Wow.
Well, and of course, Sidney Howard Gay is kind of like a nerve center of the Underground Railroad in New York. And so we have at least that letter, a specific letter saying I have a specific person. But we also have a wonderful kind of testimony to this when Stephen A. Myers, who's a prominent African-American Underground Railroad participant in Albany, kind of totals up for John Jay II what William Jay had done in his later years. And he says, that William Jay had sent along 3 from Norfolk, 2 from Alexandria, 2 from New Orleans, and the last 2 from North Carolina. So we have that accounting from Underground Railroad conductor, African-American Underground Railroad conductor in Albany, that of a specific totaling of people that he's attributing to as a sort of people referred to him by William Jay. So he's clearly in the network, although, the nature of that sort of illegal activity, generally, I know there are exceptions. I know William still recorded, has left a vast record, but generally speaking, right, people don't want to write this stuff down. The other way we know about it, of course, is that John Jay II is perhaps the leading pro bono fugitive attorney in New York City, at some risk to his reputation and occasionally even his safety. There's a case that Richard Blackett writes about that I picked up on and put in my book about after the Fugitive Slave Act. John Jay II's before a commissioner, and the Maryland slaveholder falls off and slugs him in the face. But John Jay II, both before and after the fugitive slave law, is very involved in defending, trying to gum up in court to bring habeas corpus motions, works closely with Louis Napoleon, the African-American, who's another one of the sort of heroes of New York City's Underground Railroad. John Jay II and he are clearly in collaboration. And sometimes, particularly before 1850, they're able to get state judges to issue habeas corpus rulings and to sort of basically undermine the claims of those who would claim runaway formerly enslaved people. And sometimes it's just a matter of slowing things up enough that someone leaves the jail cell door open. So there's this case of these Brazilians who are enslaved and who are on a ship in New York Harbor, and someone gets word of this, and then they're brought onto land, and John Jay II is unable to get a favorable ruling from the judge because, the sort of international dimension makes it more complicated than the domestic aspect of it. But one night the jail cell goes open and John Jay II basically does one of these, like, I don't know, but what are you going to do? And then I have a letter from William Jay who gets word of this and basically says, this is wonderful. This is what we should be doing. There's no justification for holding enslaved people in New York. And so, and then lastly, and hopefully soon to be famously, William Jay, in his last will and testament, leaves $1,000 to his son, John Jay II, specifically to be used on behalf of fugitives, which gets picked up in Southern articles as proof that this guy's a fanatic. The $1,000 I don't think was coincidental. That is also the fine imposed on Northerners for refusing to collaborate in the rendition of fugitive slaves. So originally it was going to be $500 and he ups to $1,000. I don't think that symbolism was accidental. And Frederick Douglass, who gives the major public eulogy for William Jay at the request of the Jay family, uses this $1,000 as a sort of organizing theme of his long eulogy to William Jay, and how William Jay showed us not only how to live, but how to die. And he was specifically referring to what he said, no one, as far as we know, has ever done this. Here's this former state judge, son of a founding father, making sure that in his last will and testament is a bequest that is specifically flying in the face of what is federal law, the law that even Abraham Lincoln said we have to abide by. And here's William Jay as one of his last gestures saying, I am putting up money to ensure that fugitives get justice, and that my son will, have the resources to continue to do this work. And so in all those ways, the Underground Railroad and the larger question of fugitivity is a really exciting part of the story.
Fascinating. I'd like to open up our discussion now to audience members. If you have any questions for Dr. Gellman, please enter them in the comment section of our Zoom webinar. There is one question here similar to one that I was, my next question, in fact, that I wanted to pose to you from Melina Moe, who is asking about the types of archival documents that you consulted for your research, and particularly the archival documents located in the Columbia collection. And this is something interesting to me because I'm very familiar, obviously, with the John Jay papers, but with the Jay family papers and stuff, I've looked at them, but I haven't consulted them nearly as extensively as the JJ papers themselves.
Yeah.
And also one thing Melina would like to know as well is, are there any voices of enslaved people that are documented or that come through in any of the archival documents that you've looked at for this book?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, yes, to both of those. So, I mean, I'm glad I'm here in no small part because it gives me a chance to say thank you to the marvelous work that the Rare Book and Manuscript room does, not just for me, but for scholars, all over the world. It was just such a treat to do my work in that wonderful room, in that wonderful environment, and have boxes and boxes of Jay papers presented to me, neatly organized and easy to use. And and I'm also incredibly grateful for the digitization project, which was, my timing was pretty good, that I kind of started this just as that stuff was coming online. But of course, that focused really on papers. I mean, there's some stuff that isn't just John Jay, but it's pretty much the John Jay, part of the John Jay papers. What people might not realize is a lot of the subsequent generation of Jay material is still in the John Jay paper collection. Mm-hmm. And then there's the Jay family collection. And so, you put those together and you're talking about hours and hours and hours of communing with the Jays. And so that was sort of the center of my archival work there at Columbia. I mean, I can mention, obviously, the Jay homestead was also another wonderful touchstone for me. And I spent a little time at the New York Historical Society and out at the Huntington, but the center of it all is the Rare Book and Manuscript room. And in terms of voices, right? So you don't have stuff in the hand of enslaved people, but their voices are most definitely woven throughout all the documents I've worked at. I mean, you have Clorinda insisting that Zilpa be brought home. You have an enslaved woman by the name of Dinah writing Peter Augustus Jay when he's heavily involved in the New York Manumission Society, which is further evidence, by the way, that John Jay, although he did not go nearly as far as his progeny, they loved his approval. You can see that in other contexts outside of the slavery context. And he's well aware that his son and his nephew, who he was raised as a virtual son, are major figures in the New York Manumission Society. Anyway, so Dinah writes Peter Augustus Jay and says, I was, briefly a servant with my child in your father's house in the 1790s. And then, my, indenture was transferred and I've got my freedom, but my son has not. And do you have any documentation to prove my claim? And Peter Augustus Jay, who does this is a major philanthropic effort, but now he's researching it within his own family and he writes his father. So Dinah has sort of spoken out, as it were. And John Jay basically just says, no, I don't have any documentation, basically, which is unbelievably frustrating, right? And terrible, right? That, John Jay does not say, I can't lift a finger to help this woman who was briefly a servant, or briefly for a couple of years in my house, you're out of luck. But you see the voice of Dinah's, she wants to liberate her child and she's appealing to powerful men to help her. And that voice comes through. you see it in asides, particularly from Augusta J, who's William J's wife, will often comment on what Zilpa's up to, or Zilpa's sending along her regards. You have this servant named Pete who gets dragged off to London to negotiate the Jay Treaty. And he's hazed by English servants and wants to go home. You have, and I know you probably have many New York Times readers here, so I won't take you all the way through the Abby story that Martha Jones retold in that New York Times piece, but that's one of the most troubling and memorable voices in the whole archive. There she is in Spain and France with the Jay family, and she starts getting harassed by a French servant, and she has had enough, and she runs away. And Benjamin Franklin, suggests, well, I've got connections. Let's throw her in a local jail to teach her a lesson. And then Peter J. Monroe is sort of shuttling back and forth, trying to figure out if there's a way to sort of bring this situation to an end. And she's resentful. That she's there and her husband's in America, and that that she was ill-treated. And then maybe the most and then from that, one last piece of this is this is not in the Martha Jones piece, but when Abby dies, the servants, both enslaved and free in the Jay household, think the house is haunted. And I think that, drawing on some theoretical work, that, they are consciously or unconsciously sending a message to the people who employ them, in the case of Benoit, own them, that an injustice, why would a house be haunted, right? Because, there's something unresolved. And so even in death, Abby's voice is in the archive through the haunting of those who survived her in this house in France. So, the voices of the enslaved are there. You have to look for them, right? You have to you have to read against the grain. There are oftentimes there are times when they express great sympathy for elderly and sick enslaved people, but that's not the same as the voices of the enslaved themselves. But the claims that those enslaved people make, the pain that they feel, if you read carefully and against the grain, they're most definitely in the archives, and really is what gives the archives life and meaning, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, we have a couple more questions from audience members. And again, please do submit your questions. You can do so in the chat function. We have a question from Melissa Vale, who is asking, of the changes in anti-slavery activity over the years, was there any conflict between Jays of different generations? So any divisiveness that came out on this?
It's interesting, and thank you for that question, Melissa. They're remarkable for their ability to change and become more radical and to extend their commitment with very little acrimony. But one of the things that I think is underappreciated is the way that John Jay II, who is a mere kid in college, because college started a lot earlier back then. He's in New York City in 1834 during the infamous anti-abolition riots. And he is an early member of this New York Young Man's Abolition Society. And it's in some ways, and I think we see this happen all the time in radical political movements, where the college-age kid is ahead of the adult, but is able, as sometimes happens in our lives too, to sort of encourage and pull William J. forward. And I think that's something I would never have appreciated if I hadn't thought of this in multi-generational terms, is that John Jay II is an abolitionist, becomes a radical abolitionist simultaneously with his father, in some ways, maybe even a couple of months ahead. And it becomes a partnership of father and son, in which, because of their abolitionism, we shouldn't cry too many tears for them, but they do actually take a social hit. there is a social cost. People think of given their exalted, they're wealthy people, they're well-connected people, they're connected to all of New York's aristocracy by various intermarriages. But their class of people finds that Jay's abolitionism eccentric and embarrassing. And you can see it in many of the tributes when William Jay dies, when one of the most important aspects of his life was the abolitionist cause. And some of his colleagues minimize it or refer to it obliquely, or just refer to other of his charities that are less embarrassing. But John Jay II and William Jay had each other. And they did different work. William Jay is more retiring, more of a writer than an activist. John Jay II is more of a hands-on, on the floor of the Episcopal Diocesan Convention, demanding that St. Philip's, the African-American parish, be admitted, much to the anger and chagrin of mainstream Episcopalians. So they're sort of a tag team. William Jay is more the thinker, the writer, the polemicist. John Jay II, his son, is the man in the city, taking the cases, taking a case to basically sue a New York medical school for expelling a student who they discovered had African-American heritage, right? It's like taking on suits like that. So he's more the activist on the ground, in the pit, if you will. But the fact that they had each other, I think meant a lot. And then meanwhile, you have someone like Peter Augustus Jay, who was more in his father's vein as a gradualist, as a old line first movement abolitionist in the New York Manumission Society, who stands up, as I mentioned, at the Constitutional Convention against a racial bar to voting, but kind of drops out of the abolitionist movement, and does not kind of go in with the Garrisonians. He's not anti-Garrisonian. He just doesn't go with them. And I've never detected any resentment between the brothers over that, or dismissal from John Jay II or any of the other family members. They're, as I'm sure Melissa Bell knows, they're a family that keeps each other very close generation after generation. But for the main sort of abolitionist branch, really having each other for support and encouragement mattered a great deal. And you can see it in the personal letters. And it's frankly often quite moving.
Thank you. Well, I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions, but Ty Jones had asked a question, and I'd like to actually broaden out a bit his particular query. He points out that there is a John Jay Hall on Columbia campus, and he mentions that some students and others feel that any building named for an enslaver should be renamed for someone more in line with today's campus values. What would your reaction be to the idea of taking the J name off this university building? If you think it should be kept, what argument would you make to someone demanding the name be removed? And I'd like to broaden that out, or if you'd like to just discuss J specifically, and not just the dormitory, the building on Columbia's campus, but I think other buildings and public spaces that have been named for John Jay. And if you'd like, I'd like to hear your thoughts about expanding this to the role of other enslaving figures, founding figures in particular.
Well, you're gonna leave me with a really easy question.
Okay, great. Well, let's.
No, I mean, what I think is that I would hope, and this is going to sound like an incredibly self-serving answer, but I would hope that people, as they made that decision, would, and you'll see why this is self-serving, would read a book like mine and then have the argument and make the decision, right. Because these are complex complicated lives, and particularly in the story of the Jay family, right, that he does play an important place in the history of abolition and emancipation. Not the one that I would have chosen. I would have had him have been far more radical, far earlier. But nonetheless, plays an incredibly important role in the history of the abolition of slavery in New York, and therefore in the North. And at his best moments, like in the Missouri crisis, he allows himself to, and his reputation, to be deployed to stop or to attempt to stop the expansion of slavery. On the other hand, if you read me, or if you've listened to me today, there are many, many moments in which he is callous, uncaring, self-serving, or ducks responsibility, pleads retirement to William Wilberforce, when William Wilberforce, the great British abolitionist, says, we could really use a voice like yours. And John Jay kind of says, I'm retired. So on both sides of the ledger, right, there are, for John Jay specifically, there are things that he accomplished and things that he stood for, but there are ways in which he's, of course, deeply disappointing. And then there's just the elemental fact, right? There's the elemental fact that is, there's no denying, there's no reason why anyone should or would deny it, right? He inherited and continues to own enslaved people into the 18 teens. And that is an ineluctable part of his identity in terms of class, in terms of race, in terms of position. And so if Columbia wants to make that decision, right, that slaveholding is in and of itself a reason to strip someone's name, if that's the decision that the university makes, then that is certainly a decision that they are that they have the right to make, just like there's John Jay College there in your neck of the woods as well, right? These are decisions that have to be made. What I would say, in no way, and in a sense of, this is not by way of apology or defensiveness, but we do whatever we call our buildings and whatever statues we pull down and decide to leave up. We do desperately need the story of the Jays to inform how we understand the legacy of slavery and of racism and of white supremacy. And if I could, since I can see I'm coming to the end of time, no one knew this more than the Jay descendant that I end the book with, which is this public intellectual by the name of John J. Chapman, who takes it upon himself. There's a lynching in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, which is a place that has no connection to the Jay family. And I believe in 1911, and on the first anniversary of that lynching, John J. Chapman, public intellectual, descendant of both the Chapman family of Massachusetts, Garrisonian heritage, and Jay heritage, goes and gives a speech on the 1-year anniversary in Coatesville about American race that becomes a widely republished essay on American race. And he says, like, this is everybody's county, right? And this is everybody's shame. And that you can't walk away from it. That this is 300, when he was writing it, it was 300 years. Now we would say 400 years. This is a 300-year-old story that every American has a moral obligation to face, and if possible, to face, to reckon, and if possible, to do justice, to move us forward, right? Not to forget, but to face up to the demands of the legacy. And so this is a lineal direct descendant saying that we have this obligation, right? There's no ducking it. There's no saying this is someone else's county, let alone someone else's country. And he's coming at that knowing that he is also, a descendant and inheritor of the privilege as well as the responsibility. And so we need to have these naming discussions. And my only request is that we do so by making it an obligation to inform ourselves and to think through what changes and why and what doesn't change and why. And then if the decision is made that the name needs to come off, then I'm comfortable with that. But I do think we need to, it needs to be a springboard for both, not only the conversation, but then the work that has to come out of that conversation. If these stories, if the Jay's story in this particular case is to have any meaning, and this legacy is to add up to something worthwhile.
And thank you for your extremely valuable research that you've done on this topic. I have no doubt that with the forthcoming publication of Liberty's Chain, Slavery, Abolition, and the Jay Family of New York, that this will play a role in these discussions and public engagement and questioning of the legacy of slavery, racism, and also abolition and anti-slavery in New York. So very much we're looking forward to this. This will be in April. And I'm sorry, the press will be coming out with?
So it's Three Hills, which is a division of Cornell, an imprint of Cornell University Press.
Okay, we will keep our eyes open and eagerly anticipate the publication of this work in April. So everyone, please join me in a hearty round of applause for David Gellman and his wonderful, informative, and engaging presentation looking at John Jay and the Jay family and the enslaved community who they lived with and nearby, and what light this sheds on the issue of slavery and post-slavery in New York. David, again, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Great.
So I think we will end it there. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Lena, I don't know if you're around, if you wanted to discuss the, or just mention when the next curatorial short will be. If not, I will wish everyone a good evening. And again, a particular note of gratitude to our speaker, David Gellman. Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone.